Uh, Thank you very much, and thank you to the Art Lab for inviting me here. You know, it's always a pleasure to be back, first of all, in San Francisco, to the Bay Area, and also it's a pleasure to be in this very historic place. Uh, Perhaps you know it better than me, of course, but if you haven't, before you go away, just take a little walk, because there are murals that really speak to the struggles that have taken place and the centrality of this building to many of those struggles. Now, I've been asked today to, provide words that can help, to move forward and to provide tools for the struggle that can change the society. And what I'm going to do in these 30, 40 minutes that I have, I'm going to give you some ideas of the things that I've been working on, a little bit about my past, for those of you who are not familiar with my work, but also some of the issues that I've been most interested with in the last decades, and particularly what I call building a politics of the commons, and what the commons means to me politically now, theoretically, politically, and in terms of envisaging another society and envisaging strategies that take us there. And much of what I'm going to speak about is not the product just of my theoretical reflection, but it's really the product of many conversations and experiences of struggle with women, particularly in Latin America, but not only in Latin America. I've been spending a lot of time in recent years in places like Mexico, Argentina, also more and more Brazil. In fact, I was just back from a month in Latin America. And what I've seen there has been very inspirational in my work. So there's a lot of reference in what I'll be talking about to these experiences. So in the 1970s, I come from a feminist movement. In the 1970s, I was part of the large population of feminists who basically discovered that the revolutionary movements of the past, Marxist, socialist, anarchist, right, had left out a whole population, of people being exploited, and had left out from their analysis of capitalism a whole set of activities that have been really a fundamental ground of capitalist accumulation and struggle. And of course, we have been preceded in this analysis by the anti-colonial movement, the civil rights movement, who all were very, very critical, for example, of the Marxist tradition, for always places the, wage industrial proletariat as the revolutionary subject, which always meant basically a white male working class, right, and marginalizing all the world, the slaves, the those who have been colonized. Well, the feminist movement obviously brought the whole issue of reproduction, reproductive activities, and I think part of the, revolutionary contribution that the movement of the 70s has given to the understanding of capitalism is being to recognize that the reproductive work that women have done and continue to do in all kinds of spaces, is work that is not natural, is not part or an outshot of women's physiology, and is not an activity that just reproduces our lives, but is an activity that at all points has been socially, historically constructed by capitalism, has been subsumed to the accumulation of wealth, and so it's all traversed, structured by power relation, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, that this has been, at least for women, a major terrain of struggle. And some of us who basically looked at this space, as these activities, right, as fundamental, fundamental to capitalist accumulation, fundamental to the reproduction of the workforce, and being structured in a way that will be functional to their reproduction, right? And particularly, being structured in a way that will make them unpaid, and the fact that they'll be unpaid will be, serve to naturalize it, right? And serve to create a whole hierarchy between women and men that allowed men to control women's labor, so that capitalism will not have to discipline us directly, but they'll discipline us through men, through the whole ideology of romantic love, etc., right? In fact, at that time, I coined a slogan that now has become very popular. I saw it on a number of murals when I was in Buenos Aires recently. They call it love, we call it unpaid labor. And apparently a woman had written it on a wall, and the police immediately went to cancel it. So a group of women said, okay, they will paint it everywhere. So on the basis of that, we said, well, then one of the struggles should be, to struggle to wages for housework, which we saw certainly not as a revolution, but as a tool to turn the table and to expose also what this work is really. And then, at the same time, as we were organizing around this issue by the late 70s, as you know, clearly in response, to the wave of struggle that were taking place across the planet, which I think looking backward, the 70s, the 60s and 70s was a revolutionary period, because think of it, you have the anti-colonial struggle, you have the struggle against slavery, against Jim Crow, the anti-racist civil rights movement, Black Power in the United States, the rise of the women's movement, student movement, anti-war movement, gay movement. So you have an amazing culmination of struggle that in a way subverted the organization of work, subverted the organization also of inequality, subverted the mechanism that capitalism has used to keep people divided, right? And to create hierarchies that would make sectors of workers and sectors of the proletariat basically at odds and fighting and supervising. For example, capitalism, what we analyzed in relation to women, that through the wage system, the capitalist class has given to men, particularly white men, through the power of the wage has given to men the power to supervise women's work in the home and to discipline women. Because domestic violence is really the disciplining of women to perform housework according to the expectation. And we began to realize, aha, this is why domestic violence has always been tolerated and has never been seen as really an assault on women, but something like, an excess, an exuberance of, spouses who, after all, love their wives so much, but sometimes they get carried away. And this is the way it has been treated. We heard stories and stories of women who may have, a bleeding nose, and if the police went to the house, they'll take the man and give him a cigarette and tell him to calm down. Now, I'm against asking for more penalties, and I'm against asking for jail system. But at the same time, it was very clear to us that the wage system was used as a way of dividing. Now, the struggle of the 60s and 70s really subverted at all levels in terms of the coloniality, in terms of the sexism, the racism. And that's why by the end of the 70s, you see a major restructuring of the world economy. And with that major restructuring of the world economy, which really begins in a very classical way, with a whole process of dispossession a massive expropriation, right? Imposed on population and population in Africa, in Latin America, right? This is the classic strategy of the capitalist class every time they are in crisis. When they are in crisis, then the violence, which is always there, because Marx was wrong. Marx hoped or imagined that the violence that accompanied the rise of capitalism was a one-time affair. And then with the development of capitalism, economic compulsion would do the job. People would just fall into place, because they'll be dispossessed and forced to accept exploitation. Well, actually, the violence has continued. Colonization, jails, incarceration, in no place you can see how the violence of capitalism never stopped, as in the United States, right? But certainly in the 1960s and 70s, and particularly at the end of the 70s, with the restructuring of the world economy, that violence became, escalated to a new level. And, massive dispossession, in support of the activities of mining companies, oil companies, and then the imposition of austerity program, by the IMF and the World Bank in the name of the debt crisis. I see a lot of young faces here, but those who are closer to my age will know that by the end of the 70s, this thing was declared, which was the international debt crisis. What happened? What happened is that, many countries who had just come out of the struggle against colonialism and had taken wrongly loans from the banking system of the US or England to develop, for development, the big word. In Latin America, they call it development, we call it violence. That's another important slogan. Yes. So by 79, the Federal Reserve increased the interest rate on the dollar. So if you have borrowed in dollars, immediately your debts, multiplied. And so you have all these countries who cannot pay any longer for the loans that they have taken. And this is the debt crisis, right? So, and there's a long story to say, but it's a chapter that should be studied because it really shows how, for example, the impoverishment of entire areas of the world has been highly organized. There's nothing natural about it, and whereas there's a whole racist ideology that makes it appear, and well, poor Africa, or they're coming here because they're not good enough to, activate a prosperous economy at home, so they come in here and taking jobs away from Latin America. No, those places were systematically impoverished, with legislation, with economic, financial maneuvers, and continue to be impoverished. Anyway, perhaps in the discussion we can go more into detail. So in that process, I became very interested on the immediate effect of the restructuring, for example, in reproductive work. What happens to reproduction? First of all, what happens is that you have a massive attack across the world, right, to the capacity of millions of people to reproduce themselves, right? When you have massive currency devaluation, imposed by the IMF, when you have, for instance, the fact that you have to pay a certain amount, of your annual wealth continuously to the bankers and so on, And then you have to impose a restriction. Factories shut down, right? And big concession given to mining companies because this brings in some money and this helps you. So this was the scenario. I was very, I don't know, lucky to have the opportunity to spend time in Africa during that period. And that was a second moment in my political formation, very, very important moment. You know, the feminist movement was one, and actually spending time in a country that was had come out of a colonial period, and at the same time was experiencing a new process of recolonization. Because structural adjustment, the coming of the IMF and the World Bank and so on, was really a recolonization, was really placing those countries who had just fought an anti-colonial struggle exactly in the same place where they had been. Now they had a national flag. Now they were formally independent, but in reality, the life of people at all points, right, was organized according to colonial principle. And at the same time, many of the same maneuvers that we saw in the early 80s in Africa or in Latin America, you know, very soon we also saw them in the United States, where you have massive disinvestment, right, very soon by the government in all kinds of welfare programs, right? Instead of supports to social services, you have the introduction of fees. So that, for example, now we have millions of youth who have to pay, have debt up to their neck, and you know, for the next 3-4 decades of their life, will probably doomed to pay that. Homeless people everywhere, right? These are the results of exactly the processes that I saw when I went to Nigeria in the early 1980s. And there, also my understanding of reproduction broadened because I began to see that we have to think of reproduction not only in terms of domestic work, which is central, child raising, sexual relations, sex work, the daily reproduction of life, taking care of people who are sick, etc., etc. But also reproduction is much broader. Reproduction, for example, implies all subsistence agriculture. In Africa, I saw for a large part of the world population, you know, housework, reproduction, begins by sowing something into the ground. You have a garden, you have a milpa, you have a piece of land, and you plant something, and this something is not for the supermarket, is not for the market, but is for, you know, the kitchen, the pot, the family. And so defending, for example, the subsistence farming is a very, very, very important terrain of struggle. Today, there is an immense struggle across Africa and Latin America, precisely on that, defending the right to have access to some land and to be able not to depend for your own reproduction, not to depend completely on the market, not to depend on having the ability to have money or not to have money. And to be able in the process, because if you sow, you know, if you put something on the earth, in the earth, you know what is that you're going to eat, right? And you know if what you're going to eat is going to poison you or not, if it is transgenic or not transgenic. So the whole issue of food sovereignty, the whole issue of agriculture really has become part of my own understanding of what the struggle of reproduction is about. And also, more and more, the question of the willful destruction of cropland, of rivers. I mean, we know it's the story of everyday life here too, not only in Africa or Latin America or Asia, right? The fact that comes the mining company, or the gold mine, and then you have mercury in the river that yesterday helped you to drink. You know, there are now today many population. I mean, I can mention some. You know, for example, in Colombia, in the Cauca Valley, They are rivers that people used to use for their reproduction, and now they are all contaminated with mercury because gold mines have come, and they actually use the water, to wash the gold. Same with oil drilling. And so the question of the care of nature, the care of the environment, the struggle, right? The struggle against contamination, the struggling against the poisoning of the water, the poisoning of the air, of the cropland, right? Which all implies, new forms of sickness, massive forms of, debilitation of the body, the sight, etc. So that has really made a great change in my conception of what is reproduction, what is the struggle, and also in very direct political activism, because through those experiences I've also built more of a network of connection with people in different places in Africa and in Latin America. And for instance, quite briefly, I spent also a good part of my activism fighting against the structural adjustment of education in Africa. Structural adjustment meant total disinvestment by the state in tertiary education, and then actually in every type of schooling, and basically the commercialization of the schooling system at all levels. Basically, while I was in Nigeria, the government told university, okay, if you want to keep function, get your own money. Right? So basically, a department had to transform itself into a business agency, and fees were introduced, and they started trying to figure out what kind of program would attract students that could pay and enable the department to float. And so, but I will not go into that. Now, accelerating, because I'm very interested to come to the center of my talk. What I'm most concerned with is that more and more in my work, and you will see it reflected in the books that I've produced and you find on the table, I've been interested to understand, what is the struggle that people are making to not only resisting this development, but also in that process, creating new relations. And this is what I come to call the politics of the common. I'm still very, very, very concerned, as I was in the 1970s, right, with the question of struggle for appropriation of resources to put at the service of our reproduction, right? Or to put it in other terms, revalorizing reproduction. And this to me is central. Capitalism, a system that systematically devalues human life, uses human life as an instrument, as a tool for the extraction of wealth, for private enjoyment. And so the devalorization of life, to me, what I've learned organizing around domestic work is that devaluation of domestic work, which includes child raising, procreation, et cetera, it's really a sign, a symptom, a window on something much, much bigger and very essential about capitalist society. This is society, this anti-life, is not life-affirming, and only sees human life, as basically a tool, as human bodies, as the source for an extractivist politics. What they extract is human blood, energies, our life has been sucked in by this, Marx was right, vampire-like capitalism, who has built, its skyscraper, its armies, its bombs, out of the, exploitation of millions of people now for generations. So, to me, the question, so I'm very interested still on the question of placing at the center of feminist struggle, and not only feminist struggle, the question of the reappropriation of the resources that we have produced with our work, the generations have produced, so that changing the organization of reproduction, right, is not a redistribution of poverty, is not a reorganization of poverty, so that we need to put more resources at disposal. At the same time, has also been very interested in seeing how we change how reproduction is organized. Because, you know, as an Italian feminist put it, Leopoldo Fortunati, capitalism has concentrated traditionally workers in the factory, has brought people together in the factory or the plantations. It's no longer so true, by the way, because now there is the diffused factory. Concentration of workers has become dangerous, right? Too much power, too much potential for revolt. But traditionally, for a century, it has deconcentrated, right? It has decentralized instead the reproduction of life on an everyday basis. So you have the little homes, and again, the United States is the leader, as it is the leader in every form of exploitation. There's a lot of energy and science that has been put at the service of finding more effective forms of exploitation in this country. And, you know, it's been through American imperialism, this has been taught across the world. People have been taught how to organize their community, how to torture, how to, etc. So you have the little homes, right, which individualizes reproduction, and you have women, mostly isolated, facing usually very difficult life, right? Obviously, I don't try to make, you know, one model, because in reality, I mean, there are big differences also within working class women, white women, black women, very, very different, obviously. But that form of isolation, of systematically trying to isolate people and organize form of reproduction that are actually breaking up, preventing or diluting our capacity to unite, to join, has been really a driving force in capitalist development. But what has happened is also and more now, you know, a counterforce. And I think, in my view, in no place this is more evident than in Latin America. But it's not only there. And the counterforce is that precisely in response to the type of processes that I was describing before, people being dispossessed, right? People being expropriated from the land they had, being thrown out of rural area, being forced to urbanize, entire industry shut down, right? Massive land expropriation. So people have to urbanize, and then once they have to urbanize, what do? With nothing in your hand, more and more collectively, they have built new communities, often in the peripheries of town, whether it is Buenos Aires, or it is Sao Paulo, or it is Mexico City. They have built little roads, you know, shacks and then houses, all through an amazing process of collaboration, all through an amazing process of collective work. And I've been inspired, very, very, very inspired by the role that women have played, and the women have spoken, women's organization that I've spoken with in different communities. For example, in Argentina, in what are called the Villa Miseria. These are encampments that now have many, many years. Encampments formed precisely by people expelled from the rural areas that now have developed new kind of cities. But they are places that are very, very peculiar, because they are places where the state is completely absent as service, as a provider of services. There is nothing that is publicly given to you. And the state is present only as a military force. You know, every 2 corners, you have a little booth with a young man, with a soldier, with a rifle, so there is a heavy, these are territories that are very, very controlled. They are not free from the state, right? That's very important when people speak of the vanishing of the state. Well, the state may vanish as a provider, you know, as investment in the reproduction of people, right? Providing schools or providing, for example, the collection of garbage, right? Or providing any kind of services or medical services. You don't find that. And so you have people who, yes, they build the street and they build this, and then have to face the consequences of this complete lack of services. And what has been happening more and more has been that in many cases, it has been people, and mostly women from the community, who have begun to organize around that. And they began to organize and build a network of services, activities, spaces that are not a question replacing the state, but they are ensuring 2 things, and this is something that I've come to realize, you know, with time, speaking and seeing the results of these activities. Not only have been able to provide, you know, give some guarantees of survival, you know, to communities that otherwise would have faced very, very terrible situation, right? To give you an example, I spent time with women in this village. In Brazil, they call them favelas. In one of the major encampments in Buenos Aires called Villa 21, 24. And they told me and other women I was with that they decided to mobilize after the big dengue epidemic, because many people died, and they realized that they died because there was garbage everywhere, and a lot of things were contaminated, and they discovered, well, we have to do something. Right? The state is not going to come, and we have to do, and they began to organize. Then they saw the children were being run over by trucks going to school because there's no cross light, and they've organized groups that take the children to school and bring them back. They realized there were people starving in their community, and so now they've organized ways that they check on families that they know they are on the brink of starving, and they make sure that they may have a meal a day, et cetera, et cetera. And in the process of that, they have more and more organized a whole new system of reproduction, you know, with all the limits of that. So they are dealing with question of alternative care, preventive care, recuperating knowledges in terms of herbs. There's a big, big stress throughout Latin America, if you have traveled, on the question of prevention, you know, rather than simply treatment, and the recuperation of traditional knowledge. I was in Paraguay recently. Almost at every corner in the morning, almost every corner, you find women and sometimes men who have these big bunches of leaves. And everybody stops, I'm not joking, everybody stops and takes some leaves. And they know this is for kidneys, this is for eyesight, this is for the lungs, this is for, so there is a knowledge. This knowledge, the fact that this knowledge survives and is present in an urban environment, this is the kind of knowledge that was accessible when people were in the rural area, right? Often, when you are urbanized, you lose that. For example, in Africa, people told me that they have lost a lot of the knowledge about how to fight malaria. In the villages, they always knew what to take to fight malaria. And they urbanize. So this is taking place. So it's a whole process of recreating a new forms of reproduction. And it's not only the importance of it, and for me the great inspirational power is that this is not activities, initiative that not only guarantee, a better life or the possibility of survival to more people, right? But they are also creating, first of all, they are creating a new conception of how life is reproduced. They're creating a new forms of reproductive activities, new relation, where you don't only think of your child, of your partner, but you think of the community. Where you think of well-being, you think of well-being in a broader way than simply, the person who are most immediately related to your own life. Secondly, the importance of it is that in the process of doing this work, you also build a knowledge of the community, an understanding of what is happening, what are the resources available, what is possible, what people want, what people need, what are the problems that are more common. So there's an understanding, there is a knowledge that is very, very important. And there are affective relations. There is a solidarity that is created. You know people, you know the people in the community. And this is a strength, translates into a strength when you're facing the government, when you're facing the police, when you're facing the guy with the rifle who turns the rifle against you. So there is a transformation and the creation of a new social reality. And so that ironically, from people that actually are the most dispossessed, actually out of necessity, there is an invention of new forms of life that already have done that to me, and not only to me, give you a sense of a new possibility, alternative to the kind of life that capitalism is given to us as the American dream or the model, and so forth. And I think this is very important. It's extremely important because we often imagine, and in fact I think there are sections of the left internationally that believe that the struggle against capitalism is most successful when it is conducted at the highest level of technological development, right? That it is at the highest level of technological development that you really acquire the capacity and possibility to defeat capitalism and going beyond. And my experience has been very different. It's been that, in fact, you find from people who don't have high level of technological development, but nevertheless have been forced because of, but forced perhaps is not the word. I should also add the one reason why some of these developments are more obvious in Latin America have to do because of the communitarian tradition that despite 5 centuries of capitalism has continuously to survive. You still have many indigenous communitarian regions, for example, from not only the new ones created by the Zapatistas, but you have many indigenous communities that still are managing their land and their production in a communitarian way. And the collective work generates also a certain spirit, generates a certain culture, generates certain relation that continue to affect people's life once they leave the rural area, once they go into town. So this is very, very important, and connected with that, the importance of the communalization of knowledge. Now, in other words, that what is being put into common is not only resources, affectivity, etc., but also more and more people are discovering right? The importance of sharing knowledge and creating what one calls commons of knowledge, right? So another set of activities that has impressed me has been the way, the recuperation of memory. Not only the recuperation of traditional forms of knowledges, right, but also the reconstruction of the collective memory of a community, of an area, of a region, has been more and more considered as an essential element of the everyday life and the struggle. And in fact, women have told me over and over, where people have a strong sense of memory, that's where they make the most effective struggle. That, a gold mine comes into town and immediately it's a big struggle and often a big division, because there's always people who are supporting, many times male youth, right, is attracted by the wages that a gold mine or an oil company brings after experiencing powerlessness, unemployment. Well, they come with a wage, they hire you, you have money in your pocket, it gives you certain power. It's usually the women who are fighting against it, right? But they said to me, those communities where there's more of a memory, of a sense of a common interest, where people share, and that's where the resistance is strongest, because there's more the capacity to act as a collective subject, right? The sense of collectivity. And here, too, I think that the influence of indigenous movements plays a role, because in indigenous, there's a very powerful book that has a long title. It is called Systems of Government by Gladys Tzutzul. Gladys Tzutzul, it's a Guatemaltecan activist scholar, who for the last 10 years has been working on writing about her community, which is on the highland of Totonicapán in Guatemala. And she has pursued one idea. How is it that in conditions terrible, under many attacks by conquistadores and states and so on, in my community, we still have managed to maintain some common land. And so she looks at what have been the structures that have basically given the community some power, some strength to resist under many, many attacks. And she looks, for example, at the system of parenthood, and she looks at collective labor. Collective labor is fundamental, right? From the time you are 9 or 10, she describes, you are told, okay, you have to think of the community. There's something you can do for your community. It's a whole training of thinking beyond yourself and training, and thinking about what is the common good, and that you have a responsibility to reproduce. And the common good extends not only to the people in the community, but it extends also to the trees, to the land. It extends, to the rivers, to the waters, because that is part of the life. There is a continuity between the animals, the vegetation, and the living people as well. So she looks at the fiestas, that the fiesta is not just having a good time and getting drunk, that the fiesta, a moment of resignification of the community, resignifying what it means to be part of a community. And this is why preparing for the fiesta is a big piece of work. It's not something only, concerned with amusement, but it's something that has to do, how we resignify what it means to be together, which means that we are also committed to defend it, right? So I think that tradition, that history is very important also, and has percolated into these experiences that you find from Chile, to Argentina and so on. But I think it's not unique to Latin America. I think in response to massive dispossession, massive impoverishment, and most important, through that, the increasing consciousness that capitalism cannot guarantee our life. The capitalism is a system that is destructive. And whereas we may have the possibility of the forces or the potential to only fight limited struggle, nevertheless, those struggles have to continuously have elements that project them beyond what is there, project them beyond the status quo. Those struggles, no matter how limited they may be, they have to build new relations. They have to create in people something, a different sense of what it means to be together. And to me, this has become extremely important because I've seen one of the learning that I've drawn from these experiences, and also here in the United States. I mean, the whole experience of Occupy, for example, that has been short-lived, but I don't think that is dead. I think that there's a whole generation of younger people, who's have been formed by that experience. And I know there are movements that have come out of Occupy, for example, strike debt, the movement against student debt, et cetera, et cetera. In New York, we had Hurricane Sandy, lots of young people who have been in Occupy, when the hurricane came and all areas close to the water were abandoned by the city. Nobody cared. They cared about the flood in the village. And they went and they worked with people in the community. So there's been, I think that, and the experience of being together, sharing, knowledge, sharing, organizing together the reproduction of everyday life, cleaning up, in the places that were occupied, organizing what to tell to the press, forms of, care work, the book, the library, the food, connecting with farmers. All of that was a profoundly transformative experience. In New York, in addition, we had the famous mic check, right? Mic check, right? The police prevented people from using microphone in their occupation. And so people began to use a human microphone. You say something and then everybody repeats it, right? You say something and row by row by row repeats it. And what at first seemed a nuisance became really a powerful tool, right? Because first of all, it first forced people to think more carefully what to say. Because when you say something and you hear it repeated 10 times, you better say something that makes a little sense. But secondly, that sense of a chorus, of a collective voice, of a collective subject, again, they're going beyond the separation, this little island all closed, without windows and without walls. And they're finding always new way of scaring us. Oh, be careful of people. Oh, my God. Watch, in the subway in New York, you cannot even open a book. Immediately they say, watch your possession, watch your possession. As we were always surrounded by, criminals and people ready to assault you. This is what they want us to believe. And it's part of this process of systematic division. And, well, the common is exactly the opposite. The common is to understand that my life and your life is all the same, and there is the moment that you are divided, you are immediately impoverished. You are immediately, much more vulnerable to being defeated. And reconnecting, rebuilding those connections, it's really the most powerful way, right, of confronting the state. and expanding our consciousness, expanding our imagination. I think is a collective experience that if you are in your room, in your bed, at night, thinking revolution, I mean, your thinking goes very, very, not very far. But if you are in a demonstration with hundreds of thousands of people, then you see all kinds of possibilities that you never imagined before, right? So this whole question of the collectivity and the understanding that the struggle needs a reproductive infrastructure, right? I think that a lot of mistakes of the left in the past has been to forget that, right? We need to reproduce ourselves, and we need to reproduce the struggle. And you don't just go out and fight a demonstration and confront the cops or change the world. You need to have, and when I speak of the politics of the common, when I speak of the fact that the women know what's needed in the community, the affective relationships that are created, the knowledge about, how to deal, with diseases and so forth. There is a whole reproductive structure that is important to build a struggle that is sustainable on the long term. That is not just, what often happens, an explosion and then 10 years of solitude, So this, that means that in introducing this understanding of the crucial role of reproduction, crucial not only for the capitalist class, the reproduction of the workforce, and crucial not only because it allows us to survive, but also crucial because depending on what kind of reproduction we organize, we have more power, more power to resist, more power to transform the world. And so that has to become very consciously an element of what we do in an everyday basis, whatever kind of struggle, movement, organization we create. And I spoke yesterday in Sacramento, and I was telling people that we just had in New York, I work with a group of women in New York, and we organized an event with a woman from the Dominican Republic, Rafaela Pimentel, who now is in Madrid, has been in Madrid for several years, and is a domestic worker, and she works with this very large organization called Territorio Domestico Attivo. These are all migrant workers from Africa, from Latin America, the Caribbean islands. And she described very powerfully and graphically the difficulties of organizing, when most of you have no document, you are encountering the fact you're not a citizen, you don't have documents, you have a work that isolates you many times, those who are living in, and you are a black woman or a Latino woman, and so you're discriminated. And then she talked about how important it was to establish that we need to reproduce ourselves. We need to think of not only the struggle that we have to make towards the outside, but the struggle that we have to make so that we reproduce ourselves so that we can go another day, so that we can go, and not only we can go another day, but also we continuously nourish in ourselves the spirit, the wish, the ability to fight. That reproduction has to give us strength and joy and pleasure, and so that we can actually continue. So that our life is not just a continuous misery, but part of the struggle is also to place joy in our life. And that was very powerful. People responded very, very powerfully. And I agree completely with it. In the booklet, the last book that I published called Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, which is about the theme of going beyond the individual self, the last article It's called In Praise of Joyful Militants. In praise of joyful militants. The fact that militants might take you in a very difficult situation, but in itself has to have an element of joy. Right? If you do political work, if you engage in any struggle, that struggle must immediately, in the present, change positively your life. Right? But enough with struggle where, it's always in the future, right? There was this song, socialist song. I'm not trying to put down the history of the socialist movement, right? But this notion of this, il sol dell'avvenire in Italian, I come from Italy, the sun of the future. Well, the sun has to be also in the present, right? And so Raffaella was telling us how from very soon they decided, when we have a meeting at the end, let's have a dinner together, like people have here, or they began to make song. Let's not only think of, the fight with this and that. Let's also spend time making songs. And so they did songs about domestic workers and their fight, and dancing. So we have a time when we get together to dance, And so the fact of being together already makes a difference, not only because we have a program of trans, which is very crucial, but also because it nourishes our life. It's life-affirming. It creates new affectivity, love is a tremendous energy, and care and trust and confidence immediately change your life. So I think that this is extremely important, and this is one of the, is some of the themes that I develop in the books that you find in Re-Enchanting the World, which is really a lot about the commons and with the specific experiences from situations that I've been in. And also in terms of, how we have to transform our life, our reproduction, our relation with people, and the struggle that we make if we want to transform the world. Thank you very much. Actually, there's no reason for me to put down the, yes. So now, let's see, I think we have time for questions.
I have a...
And, I'll be happy to hear some of your comments, questions, criticism, anything.
I can bring around a microphone for anyone who has a question.
Oh, yes, it's past one. I'm sorry that I spoke longer than I thought
I
was going to.
Hi, Silvia. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Susana. I'm from Bogota, Colombia, and I've been living in the Bay Area now for 6 years. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here and hearing you. Thank you so much. And my question is also kind of more like a question for all of us and a comment, living in the Bay Area. And it really resonates with me, the idea of building this community, right? And for me, what I see, my experience in the Bay Area is that because there's many of us that are immigrants, many of us that are locals, have been here for many, many years, and we also have the indigenous. I feel like, we're so separated in many ways, right? And it's kind of like a big challenge. So my question is kind of like, how do we start building that from more like a common sense, like community, really? Because it feels like there's so many separate struggles, and this is more like it can be a big discussion, but it's really how to start building it in this place where it feels sometimes really isolated, right?
Yes.
And like me, I'm an immigrant. I've been here 6 years, and I still am really connected with the struggles happening in Colombia, but I also feel like I have an important role here and start connecting with people here. Right. So how do we start building that from here, where sometimes it feels like there's so many identities and so many struggles pulling different places. So how do we find that union in this?
This is something about, it's true. It's really different that whenever I come back to the United States, I encounter, because, for example, on a different note, I mean, in Argentina, women in the feminist movement have created spaces where different women from different places, different groups come together. So, for example, you have women from the union that can come together and discuss common strategy with women from the solidarity economy, which is already a big network. Solidarity economy could be a group, a collective fighting against transgenic food, could be a group fighting against the mine, etc. So there's spaces in which actually, and this is what enables, right, the movement to bring thousands and thousands and thousands of women in the streets, but also to organize platforms that are very articulated, that are not, only concerned, for instance, with improving, the life of women, but also are looking at the whole question of transforming social relations. We have the question of land, the question of the fight against extractivist politics, and so forth. And I think, for instance, one tool that has been used by many women, again, this mostly from conversation with women in Europe who were preparing for the 8th of March and the famous strike, right? It's very difficult for women who have family, children, etc., to organize a strike. Obviously, when we speak of a strike, we speak of something very different from the traditional union strike. But the way women have used the idea of the strike as being to make connection with groups of women that they would not normally encounter. That the idea that we are all going to go together on that day, do something or organizing what we're going to do, which is not necessarily one model, one thing, one activity, but a variety, right? As a tool, right, the possibility of beginning to contact, or creating spaces where women coming from, union women can, be called to come, or women that are coming from, a trans community, or women that are coming from, can come together and see what we want to do for that day. And so that there are ways, strategies that can, enable us to at least overcome, at least beginning to make those contacts. Obviously, that's only a beginning, because then the issue is how do you deal with power relations, with inequality, what kind of organizational forms, right? But the first step has to do first to assume that we are in the same struggle, and that we have to find ways of being in the same struggle. Or we are in a struggle in which, in the end, even if we may be exploited differently, and in some cases in far more intense way, that nevertheless, creating those spaces assume that none of us, no group, can be free, or unless everybody else is. And I think, I think I would say it's important to understand, how do we create spaces that can bring women from different communities together, and in that way begin to articulate, right? Because one lesson of the feminist movement has been that in a society that has systematically created inequalities, I always say capitalism does not only produce private accumulation of wealth, but it's production of inequality, production of difference, systematic. This is one of the power, systematic production, right? And that's why racism and sexism as really structural element. There's still a discussion that is going on in some quarters of the left, where gender and race and so on are, key elements, of a capitalist society. Discrimination on the basis of race or gender are key elements. And some people say, no, 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 you can think of capitalism, logically, you can think of a capitalist society built on the exploitation of labor without assuming that they have to be racist. And I would say no, because if you look at the last 500 years and more of history, you will find that at no point, capitalism has been able to survive without this continuous reconstruction. Every new phase of development guarantees that there is a new, giving new foundation, right, to this inequality. So that means, in that kind of society, that means that you cannot say, oh, let's all unite and fight. That's a beautiful ideal, but unity is in the future. It's not a given. And so the question, part of the struggle, is to figure out, how do we struggle together in a situation in which the inequality do not lead, as often in the past, to one sector, or dominating the others, right? And one sector, imposing its interest at the expense of the others. So, but my suggestion is that, for instance, the construction of, I think for the last few years, the construction of the 8th of March has been a very useful tool for many women to expand, to connect with others, to go beyond the small collective and begin to create those spaces.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Anyone else? All right.
Yes?
We'll go to Kara next.
So, hello.
Hi.
Do I have to stand up? Okay. My name's Molly Hankwitz, and I'm an artist, among other things. And I found your talk very interesting. Thank you so much for coming. It's really hopeful in such a hard time I think we're having in this country. I have a kind of thorny question, sorry.
Sure.
But getting to your idea about the state, right? You were talking at one point about these new areas growing up with this communal activity and the care of others taking primacy and planting and women's work essentially sort of being recognized as something which is a powerful resistance, but at the same time, those same areas being under military control, okay? So my thorny question is the problem of violence, honestly, because I think we're living in a time when the curiosity about or the presence of violence is flipping back and forth between groups like Bundy's protecting their land in Oregon and with guns, right? And the history, say, in the Black Panther Party, where they also nurtured and had daycare centers and fed people as part of their community love, but also had arms, right? Because they were protecting themselves from the state, the other state, the state that has the weapons. So this question is really about that. Like, how do we reproduce in a condition, in those conditions? Or how are they create fear, obviously, but at the same time, I guess it's how do we eke away at the state to keep it from taking up guns against us?
Yeah. Well, they are already keeping us. The question, So, number one, I'm not suggesting that building the commons that I've described, right, is the only struggle that is existing. But I'm suggesting, for example, that kind of activity is fundamental in the real material sense of being the basis, the material basis for every struggle, right? The kind of struggle where, more and more, for example, you are in the fight as an abstract subject without any real relation being built with the other people that you're involved in, etc. That element of reproduction for the struggle. So I'm speaking of equality of struggle. So I'm not suggesting that rules out, confrontation with the state, etc. but I'm suggesting that how do you strengthen, how do you organize in a way where, for instance, for the majority of people, life on everyday basis is a constant challenge, right? And where you're working, you are under continuous pressure, you have, and for many to add going to a meeting, for instance, or doing something politically, joining a protest, often becomes or is seen as another piece of work. Is seen as, oh my God, I'm going to further complicate my life. Already it's difficult to get through the day, to get through a week, and I have the children, I have the this. And this is also what I'm referring to. I'm referring that this kind of different conception of what implies, what is involved in changing the world, making a struggle, being able to make a struggle that is not one day, 1 week, one big demonstration, but has a long-term horizon as we have to have, because we will not change this system, with any cataclysmic event. This system is built into centuries and has, plunged its roots very deep into our own personality as well. We all bear the scars of this capitalist society. And the process of the struggle is the process of constructing the alternative. It's the process not only of opposing capitalism, in my view, but also constructing something positive, constructing new relations, and healing, liberating ourselves of the amount of capitalism that we have in us. So I think that the struggle is a very, very, very important, because the point is, yes, we defeat capitalism and what we put in its place, right? So the struggle has this double edge that on one side has to, in a sense, disarm the state, in a broad sense. But it also has, to establish a new structure of value. It has to establish new relation. It has to establish, okay, what do we want? What kind of society we want to build? That can only be established in a process of struggle, in a process of continuous relationing with other people and working and experimenting, etc. So this is what I'm interested in bringing out. So what I was trying to address was not a kind of blueprint for what do we do to defeat capitalism. But I'm trying to say something that I think is very important, and something that has given me a lot of hope, because seeing, for example, that it is in communities and they have so little, and yet have been able to express because of their determination to cooperate, in their understanding that only if we come together we are not going to have a total miserable defeat, right? That there's been something very important that has been generated, without romanticizing, as you said, those very women and communities that are now commoning. They have to deal with the narco-traffickers that coming in, and they are, maybe threatening them. So all those issues are there. But what is also there is precisely this creation of a social fabric that generates more solidarity, that generates more power, that generates more capacity for resistance. And then there's another question.
Hi,
Yeah.
over here. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, thanks.
Yes.
Hearing you talk about, you kind of started to answer maybe where I was headed in the end of your comment, but hearing you talk about the politics of the commons kind of makes me think about, what are the possible interventions to build that power? Is it public banks? Is it universal childcare? Are there ways in which you could see, mechanisms for transition, as opposed to or like capitalism, we got to burn it down before we can build something else. Like, where are the opportunities for transition?
I mean, that is really the big question now. That is the big question of, because, I mean, we're talking about what is the range of possibilities. And so, that also, and in this struggle, there's obviously not one model, right? But I would say, to me, the road, it's a road that less and less, right, depends on the state for organizing our life. And it's not a road that says, oh, we just forget about the state, right? No, because the state has our wealth. That's very important. The state has the monopoly of violence and wealth, so so you have to confront the state. You have to negotiate, fight with, et cetera, because they have a tremendous control of the wealth in their hands. So, for instance, in the case of a daycare for children, like the one you're holding, right, I think it's different if you make a struggle to force the state to give us the resources to organize daycare, et cetera, and then we decide what is going to happen in those places. Unlike allowing the state to decide how a daycare is going to be run. Obviously, all depends on the level of forces. What are the forces that you have that can move the state in one direction or the other? But in terms of, on principle, I think it's very different to ask the state or force the state to relinquish in one form or another resources for our reproduction, or to imagine that, there's going to be a state that basically has the master plan for, our healthcare, our this, our that. So, resources for healthcare, yes. But basically what I'm trying to say is that there has to be a whole organization from below to decide what kind of healthcare, for example, we want. It's not only to have the right to healthcare, which is fundamental, but also to decide what kind of healthcare we want, what kind of medicine we want, what kind of care we want. Because the care that the state gives us is in many cases terrible. And, today there's very little time. I mean, I've had cancer twice, and I would say that every time, and I'm very privileged, I have insurance, I have Medicare, and I also have some insurance from the school where I was teaching. So I'm a very privileged, I should be all happy. And every time I was so scared, and I was more scared of the doctors. I was more scared of the system, not the individual person. I was scared of the health system and what they would do with my body. And the lies they would tell me, totally convinced that they were for my own good, than I was of the disease itself. And several times I told them, I'm more afraid of you than I am of the cancer. And I'm not exaggerating. You may think I'm exaggerating, but so many times, at so many points, I had to make a fight because what they were telling me were according to a protocol that I knew was wrong. And I don't know what the experience. I know that for many women today, for instance, particularly women who have no resources, proletarian women, black women who have really low resources, going to have a child in a hospital is a nightmare, right? You don't go to have a child with a spirit, this is beautiful, everybody's going to be helpful, everybody's going to be supportive and nurturing. No, you know there is going to be a battle because they are going to let you alone in a room until, the waters break, and after the waters break, they might give you 2-3 hours, depending on the hospital, to deliver. And if you don't deliver fast, they don't have the time, to follow the natural rhythms of the body. But you have to fast, assembly line, get the child out. Or a cesarean cut. And women now are actually arrested and criminalized if they refuse a cesarean cut. There are women now in jail who have refused a cesarean cut, and then something went wrong with the birth and they were accused of manslaughter, even though there was no evidence that refusing the cut had an impact on the delivery. So this is what I'm talking about now. Basically, you go and give birth and you are hooked up with a wire here, wire here, wire here. And instead of being participant, in this activity that potentially is one of the most important in your own life, you're like completely passive, and it looks like it's the doctor who is, delivering. The doctor is the actor, he's the life giver. You're there like crucified on the bed, right? And there's some really powerful and terrifying description of what it means to give birth if you don't have the means to go to a private clinic. And then you have all these new methods, and then you can have the happy birth. Right? This is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about reclaiming. The politics of the common is about reclaiming the control of our life, reclaiming the ability to decide. And this reclaiming can only be done collectively. It can only be done collectively. It can only be done on the basis of, solidarity from below. And I must add, solidarity with the living, and also solidarity with the dead. Because this is what the question of memory is also about, right? It's always bringing in the present, in whatever we do in the present struggle. Right, the memory of those who made the struggle before us, the memory of the injustices that have been committed. The past, I've done a lot of historical work, and I've become convinced more and more that history is never a closed book. To me, the story of the witch hunt is still living, is still present. And so is the history of slavery, and so is the history of all the lobotomies that they've done on women. Is the history of all the sterilization that they've done on black women in this country. Is the history of all the jail, the people have been electrocuted, the people have been, and they continue to be executed. And all that has to be with us as we move, with us as we moved. We cannot afford to leave it. This is what recuperating the collective memory is about, because we have a lot of unfinished businesses. And as I said, solidarity with the dead is as important as solidarity with the living. And I guess the time is over. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you.